All right, Benita, I have 11:03. We've got quite a few people on. Let's go ahead and get started. I will turn it over to you, or I'll stop my share and you can begin.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our March Task Talks. I'm so excited to hear today about the USDA Dietary Guidelines, and we're going to get an overview with a focus on cholesterol. And you guys know with our CDC funding how exciting it is for us to get some more information about that. So we're looking forward to the presentation today, and I will turn it back over to David, but want to thank you all for joining us.
Welcome everyone to another edition of our Task Talks. Just a quick friendly reminder, mute your microphone if you haven't already. I will be monitoring the chat today, so if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and I will make sure that our speaker gets them. We're going to try to hold the questions till the end to get through the presentation. We're going to try to keep the presentation to under an hour, so get you out of here right around noon. But if you absolutely have something that you just can't wait, go ahead and unmute yourself and feel free to ask the question. So now I would like you to help me welcome Jennifer Seymour today. Jennifer Seymour is a PhD. She's the Senior Policy Advisor with the Division of Nutrition, Physical Activity, and Obesity with the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. In her position, she addresses the scientific and policy implications of nutrition and obesity interventions. Additionally, she regularly provides CDC's perspective on national and international regulations and guidance, including those from FDA, USDA, HRSA, the WHO, and PAHO. Dr. Seymour was the CDC lead and a member of the HHS leadership team for the development of the dietary guidelines that we're going to talk about today. Those were released in December, and she has been involved in the creation of the dietary guidelines since the 2005 edition. Dr. Seymour spent part of 2018 working at the World Health Organization on their efforts to eliminate trans fats globally. She is assisting CDC's Division of Diabetes Translation in updating the science behind the Diabetes Prevention Program. She has also worked with the USDA for many years on efforts to include public health, obesity prevention efforts, and policy, systems, and environmental change interventions in the SNAP-Ed program. She was the lead scientific reviewer for HBO's 2012 Weight of the Nation documentary series and public awareness campaign in 2010. She worked as a policy advisor in the office of First Lady Michelle Obama at the White House. She assisted in planning and carrying out activities for the Let's Move initiative and continued to work with Let's Move through 2016. So everybody, please help me in welcoming Jenna. Jenna, the floor is yours. You have control of the screen. You may begin. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Let me get my slides up on the screen.
While you are loading that, Jenna, I will remind everybody that on our website, you're going to have all these resources and a copy of this video. I also have a link to download the full version of the dietary guidelines.
Yes, which is great, because the first thing I'm going to say is the dietary guidelines are quite extensive. And so this is going to be a quick overview of what is in them, and with a focus on cholesterol, because I know that's an area that you guys are focusing on. So what I'll do is throughout the presentation, I'm going to point out where cholesterol comes up, but then I'm also going to just talk about it briefly at the end, and a little bit about some of the big changes that have happened over time in the dietary guidelines. So the 2020 through 2025 edition was released in mid-December, and it was done over a period of many years to put this together. It's a long process that usually starts not terribly long after the last one is created, because there are dietary guidelines every 5 years. I think it's important to know that there are sort of key dietary principles that that are at the heart of how the dietary guidelines are written. The first is that most people should meet their nutritional needs primarily from foods and beverages. And so that's really getting at, yes, there might be some need for supplements, but overall, most people can get most of their nutrients from the foods and beverages that they eat. It's really important to choose a variety of foods from all of the different food groups and to pay attention to portion size. And so all of that is an overarching issues. Then I just want to use this slide. This is right out of the Dietary Guidelines, a picture that really talks about the way that healthy eating can impact health and chronic disease. And you will notice in multiple places, not really in terms of birth to 24 months, but in terms of children and adolescents, there is evidence of lower total and low density lipoprotein cholesterol with a healthy diet. It doesn't come up so much for women who are pregnant and lactating, but obviously they are adult women. And so within the adult category, you see a lot of issues around heart disease, stroke, and cholesterol. So there really is a good focus within the Dietary Guidelines on the issues of focus for this group. So let's start with what the guidelines actually are. So there are 4 overarching guidelines, and then there's a lot of detail under each of those guidelines. And the first is to follow a healthy dietary pattern at each life stage. And so this is really the big thing that is different about these dietary guidelines from the past, is that it focuses heavily on life stage. And I'm going to go into more detail later about some of the life stages that are really much more focused on in this dietary guidelines than what has been in the past. So, sorry, I have to say, somehow I have to make sure to get rid of the pictures that are covering my slides. So, okay, there we go. So the second dietary guideline is to customize and enjoy nutrient-dense foods and beverage choices that reflect personal preferences, cultural traditions, and budgetary considerations. And again, this is an area that's expanded from previous editions. There really is a lot of focus on the way that you can make a healthy diet work for many different people from many different backgrounds. I have to say, one of the things that really struck me, one thing that David didn't mention in my background is that before I got into nutrition, I had got a culinary degree. I went to culinary school and worked as a chef for a while. And there are some foods listed in the dietary guidelines that I've never heard of. And so they really are taking on much more of the multicultural nature of the United States. Then the third guideline really is the guideline that is what the dietary guidelines always were in the past. It's talking about the need to eat from all of the different food groups and then to stay within calorie limits. And then the fourth, and I will say the fourth has also been at the heart of the dietary guidelines in the past, which is to limit foods and beverages that are higher in added sugars, saturated fat, sodium, and to limit alcoholic beverages. So I'm not going to go through all of this information, but I want this to be available for you so that you can read it in more depth. But the important thing, and the first thing I will say about the first guideline is that there's a really big difference from previous editions. The dietary guidelines in the past always started at the age of 2 and went up from there. And there was a real push for many years, and Congress put in a farm bill maybe 10 years ago that there really should be an expansion of the dietary guidelines to go all the way back to birth. As that was being done and birth to 24 months of age was being added into the guidelines, it became very clear that there also should be a lot more information for pregnant and lactating women. And so that was added in to the guidelines as well. And so this is the first time that the guidelines have actually said things like, for the first 6 months of life, exclusively feed infants human milk. This really is very new to the guidelines, and it goes on and talks about at about 6 months to introduce infants to nutrient-dense complementary foods, and then talking about at 12 months to start children on to follow a healthy dietary pattern like the rest of the population. As I was saying about guideline 2, this is where it talks a lot more about all different ways that you can meet the dietary guidelines based on your individual background, the diverse cultures, the diversity in how much the socioeconomic status, etc. There are many ways. Sorry, that was an accident, but I won't go back on the slides. Then the guideline 3 really goes into a lot more of this detail about vegetables, fruits, grains, make at least half of those whole grains, dairy to consume fat-free and low-fat milk, yogurt, cheese, and protein foods, and then oils. And then guideline 4 really talks about added sugars, saturated fat, sodium, and alcoholic beverages. And so what I will say here is the guidelines at this point really focus in on cholesterol in terms of saturated fat. That really has moved over time, and I will talk about that more going forward, to really say that when it comes to blood cholesterol, saturated fat is the issue, and less than 10% of calories starting at age 2 is very important. Earlier than that, there is reason why children should be consuming more saturated fat, and so that is fine. Whereas with added sugars, and I think it is important to know more research is coming forward. The dietary guidelines aren't yet really making a strong statement about this, but there is more evidence coming forward about sugars and blood cholesterol as well. So I think it is really important that for the last 2 guidelines, for the first time in 2015, there actually was a numeric amount of added sugar that people's diets should be under. So it says less than 10% of calories per day starting at age 2. And in this case, for children under the age of 2, added sugars should be avoided completely. And then sodium is less than 2,300 milligrams per day. This is the same and has been the same for a long time for the dietary guidelines. But the difference is now there's much more talk about even less for children under the age of 14. And so there are recommendations that go all the way down to the earliest ages. And then alcoholic beverages has changed quite a bit over time as well. And so I won't read out all of this, but there is a lot more talk about people there's no reason to start drinking if you don't drink, and that drinking less is better for health than drinking more. So one thing I do really want to point out, I think this is a very important point to understand about the way the dietary guidelines are written and how to understand them, is there's sort of this 85-15 rule, which, and I would say it comes just out of doing analysis of diets and finding that in order to meet the recommendations for vegetables, fruits, grains, dairy, and protein, you're using up 85% of the calories that are available in a diet to stay within calorie needs, to not go over, to not likely gain weight. And so that only leaves 15% of calories for any saturated fat, extra added fat, added sugar, any alcohol, anything extra, or just extra calories from the food groups that you need to consume. And so it really is important to understand that in some ways, when you do the calculations, there's very little room, likely a lot less room than what the recommendations suggest. Like, it's really hard for anyone to stay within their calorie needs if they are eating 10% of calories from added sugar, as well as 10% of calories from saturated fat. And if you are consuming any alcohol, you likely are going over your calorie limit. And I think that's an important thing to take into account. So quickly, again, this is something that you can look at in more detail, but what I just want to point out here is that the purple represents meeting recommendations, and the blue represents not meeting recommendations. And so these are the various vegetable categories, the first 6 lines here, and you can see that most people are not eating enough vegetables. Same thing is true for fruit. The grain situation looks a little better until you split it out into whole grains and refined grains. And what you see is people are eating a ton of refined grains, well over recommendations, and almost no one is meeting. There's just this tiny sliver of people who are meeting the whole grain recommendations. So same thing is true for dairy, just barely any person is meeting the dairy recommendations. And then for protein foods, it looks somewhat okay when you look at protein in general. But if you look at seafood intake, very few people are meeting recommendations for seafood intake. So there is a lot of information within the guidelines about sources of the nutrients of concern. And so a big thing to see here is if you look at where people are getting their added sugar, a very significant portion comes from sugar-sweetened beverages, and it does split it out down here so you can see what portion is soft drinks versus fruit drinks, and then desserts and sweet snacks. And so when you combine those two, it comes close to 50%, especially if you add in coffee and tea. The reason coffee and tea is separate here is because this is coffee and tea where you're getting it without sugar and then people are adding it in rather than being inside the sugar sweetened beverages category. But really, when you look at this, the beverages and desserts make up the bulk of added sugar in people's diets. And you can see the same kind of thing for saturated fat. Of course, here's where it's most important for cholesterol with the evidence that we have. And it's a little bit, I mean, yes, you can see that sandwiches make up a good portion and desserts make up another good portion, but it's really, saturated fat is found throughout people's diets. And so that's an important thing to note, is that it's not as direct. I think there's much more evidence that if you can get people consuming less sugar sweetened beverages and less desserts, you really can have an impact on added sugar intake, whereas it's a little more getting it out of multiple places within the diet for saturated fat. And the same thing is true for sodium, although sandwiches is certainly a big part of where sodium is coming from. But I think this really shows that sodium is just found throughout, especially the processed food. And so that's why a lot of us work on limiting the sodium in a lot of processed foods as part of how to deal with sodium. So there are also any number of, this is just one example of something that's in the dietary guidelines that shows ways that you can adjust a diet to make it better for, make a healthier diet. And so it'll give a typical choice and, oh, sorry, give a typical choice and then it'll show another choice that would be much healthier, like using a very heavily sugared fruit yogurt versus getting low-fat yogurt that's plain and then putting fruit in it, as an example. And then another example here, I won't go into a lot of detail with this, but it just shows, like, here's a typical burrito bowl and here's what it could be and the differences for all the different food groups and nutrients. So now I want to go into a little more detail about the parts of the dietary guidelines that are really different. And this includes infants and toddlers. And so what you can see within birth to, oh, I don't know why, I do not think I am touching anything, but it is moving forward on its own for some reason. So I apologize about that. They really talk a lot about how birth to 24 months is a critical period for growth and development. It's key for establishing dietary patterns. That's why a lot of people really want to focus on nutrition in young kids, when you can really affect their taste. And it really talks a lot about human milk feeding. And I think it's important to understand why they are saying human milk feeding. And that really is that our evidence is not really strong enough to separate out and say the difference between the benefits. Now, this is for nutrition. I just want to be clear because I think we know the benefits of putting a child to the breast versus pumping and feeding human milk to a child in terms of nutrition. So they have just talked about both of those as one thing. And then, of course, really, there's a lot of talk about readiness to eat solid foods. And there are a lot of special considerations within this population, supplementing with iron, vitamin D, and vitamin B12, and then really a lot of different foods to avoid for infants, like added sugars, high sodium foods, all kinds of unpasteurized foods, cow's milk, soy beverages, plant milks, toddler milks, and caffeine. Then there is a big change in looking at women who are pregnant or lactating, and there's a lot of information here, a lot of information about the fact that the dietary pattern really is very similar to dietary patterns for all adults. It's just that there is this difference in terms of calorie levels. There's a lot of discussion about nausea, vomiting, food aversions, and food cravings, the kinds of things that would just never come up in the previous dietary guidelines because they didn't really focus on these populations. A lot of information has come out in the last couple of years about allergies and some really good evidence that women should not be limiting foods to prevent allergies in their children, and that actually it's likely the opposite, especially with peanuts, that consuming peanuts and having, unless of course you have an allergy to peanuts, and actually giving peanuts to children at younger ages has been shown to really lessen peanut allergies specifically, and the evidence is getting stronger for other allergies as well. There's a lot of information for vegetarian and vegan women and the importance of supplementing certain nutrients, and a lot of information about weight and what is the right amount of weight to gain. And then a lot about food safety, which is very important for pregnancy and lactation. And then again, there are a lot of special considerations in terms of folate, folic acid, iron, iodine, choline, seafood, alcohol, and caffeine. And then there now really also is a big focus on older adults as well, and really making sure that there is information about dietary guidance for older adults. And so for the dietary guidelines, that means 60 plus, and really it gets into the idea of older adults being more susceptible to chronic diseases, to osteoporosis, and really starts talking about sarcopenia for the first time, which, if you don't know, is the loss of muscle mass. And it really talks about the idea that some older adults have difficulty chewing and swallowing, which can impact intake, and also talks about food safety and because of a decline in the immune system. And then there are also quite a few special considerations here. It talks about the need for more protein in older adults, the fact that vitamin B12 often can't be absorbed as well. Beverages, there's a loss of thirst with age, so it's very important to be drinking enough beverages. And it talks about alcoholic beverages and the idea that you can feel alcohol much more with age, and so drinking less is probably a good idea from what you might have drunk as a younger adult. So now I want to talk more about cholesterol specifically, and really getting into where the dietary guidelines have been on dietary and blood cholesterol recommendations, because you may have noticed that although I was pointing out some places where blood cholesterol comes into the equation, there was no mention of dietary cholesterol. And this has been a big change over time. And I won't read through each of these examples, but I went through because the dietary guidelines started in 1980 and really wrote down the way they talked about dietary cholesterol and fats over the course of the time that the dietary guidelines have existed. And they really have slowly moved from saying like that you should eat not too much fat as well as saturated fat and cholesterol, to really getting more into talking about only having a diet low in saturated fat and cholesterol and moderate in total cholesterol, and then really moving toward saying that you should switch from consuming saturated fat to consuming mono and polyunsaturated fat, and that you really should be replacing fat with fat. That was a big argument after it became very clear that as people were replacing fat with carbohydrates, that was really not good and really did cause a number of problems. And starting with the 2015 guidelines, they got rid of the mention of a limit on dietary cholesterol. And this was very interesting and controversial among some people, but really the evidence was becoming clearer over time that saturated fat has a big impact, as well as trans fat, on blood cholesterol, but the dietary cholesterol, it's not as clear that that 300 milligrams is an appropriate number, that there are healthy diets, like healthy vegan diets, where you'll have no cholesterol whatsoever in the diet, but there are also healthy diets that have more maybe eggs in them and leaner meat that will have, or where you're eating plenty of seafood and so you're getting maybe a lot of cholesterol from shrimp, that really are healthy diets, and that you could be over 300 milligrams. And so it just became clear that it was important to change the language to say that you should not be eating a ton of cholesterol, but that as long as you're eating a healthy diet, there was no specific number anymore that was right for dietary cholesterol. And really, they are focusing much more on what impacts blood cholesterol levels, and the bulk of that is saturated fat, but that's also where we're moving to talking more about added sugars, as there's more evidence that added sugars, really I should say sugars, that sugars also have an impact. The reason we talk about added sugars is because of the public health implication that it's much easier to take the added sugars in diets out than it is to limit the natural sugars that come from some very healthy foods. And so that really has been this noticeable change in the dietary guidelines over time. So then, as I come to the end of this presentation, I really want to focus on a couple things about the fact that the dietary guidelines don't just talk about the individual diet, and they really do talk about the role everyone has to play in supporting access to healthy foods where people live, learn, work, play, and gather, that it's important to have healthy, safe, and affordable food for every individual to have a healthy dietary pattern. They also, I think it's important to know, have a lot of materials that are available to use in public health practice. This is just one example about customizing the dietary guidelines framework. It's too small for you to read, but it is available on the dietary guidelines website that you can see at the bottom of the page. And this is really where they are talking about all the different ways, and there are a lot of different foods that you may not have heard of before in these lists of the foods that would qualify as healthy foods for a healthy diet. And I think it's important to know this is just one example, and they are just the other day I got a message saying that they had added a whole bunch of new resources onto the Dietary Guidelines website. So there really is a lot, and there will be more coming to help for any kind of programmatic work using the Dietary Guidelines. And I'll stop there.
There we go. Had to unmute myself, doing the normal Zoom thing. So thank you very much. Appreciate that. Do we have any questions? I know specifically we have at least a couple of nutritionists out there, whether the questions will come from them or somebody else. If you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself, or as I said before, you can type it into the chat and ask. Benita, do you have anything?
I have a question.
Sure, Kristen.
I was just curious. I have one of my good friends is a nutritionist, and she was telling me about kind of infant health and guidelines. And I was curious why, if you have any idea, why do you think it took us so long to get those guidelines for under 2? I don't have any kids, so it was new to me. I was like, why wouldn't we have guidelines for,
Yes. So the original, this goes back to just history and the historical nature of the dietary guidelines. It was actually, if you may have heard this story a number of times, it was when President Eisenhower had a heart attack that started down this path of there needs to be some kind of dietary guidance for the general population. And of course, that was in the 1950s, and it took until 1980 for the first dietary guidelines to actually happen. There was sort of a special commission that happened in the 70s. And so some of it was just around the idea that it was centered on chronic disease and older people, and some of those early dietary guidelines really didn't even say it was for 2 and up. They were just this more of a pamphlet. If you look back at all the guidelines are available, you can see them if you want to. If you look at the 80, 85, 90, 95, they were basically just a little pamphlet for individuals. Starting with 2005, it really became this much more robust effort to have a federal advisory committee that did reviews that really went into a lot of detail. And at that point, they really were still focusing on chronic disease only. And so there was this sense of, and of course, why they felt that 2-year-olds, what mattered was chronic disease. It's hard to say, whereas under was not, but it really was focused on chronic disease. And it was only as there started to be more talk about the idea of this really needs to be dietary guidance for the entire population for all issues, that you really started to see a desire among people to include dietary guidance for all people. And so of course, some of this is just about how long it takes for things in the government to happen. And like I said, it was about 10 years ago that a farm bill was passed that said that the guidelines should expand to include birth to 24 months. And then there was this whole process, because it was so new to the guidelines, that it really did require a lot of work to gather all the evidence from going way back to really understand what, and of course, because for the first time it was bringing in ideas of growth and development and brain health and all of these things. And what I am hoping to see is, as we go forward, there will be much more push to think about all of those issues for the entire population, because I think it still is more focused just on chronic disease as you get older. And it would be nice to say, 2-year-olds, growth matters also, brain development still matters, all of those things. And so it's a process to expand the dietary guidelines in many ways. And I think that was a big part of it. Another just really quickly part is that the process was being done by people who were not necessarily really much of experts in the field of child health and human development. And so that was another whole thing. And so the committee that did the reviews was expanded from 12 to 20 people to take on the fact that there needed to be much more expertise to do this process.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you for the history.
Does anybody else have any questions?
David, I saw one in the chat, I think from Cindy.
There we go. Yes. Actually, we have a couple. So we'll start with Cindy. She says that I noticed that you did not mention anything about sugar-free beverages. Was that discussed in revising the guidelines?
So yes, it was, and at this point, the dietary guidelines do still say that consuming artificially sweetened or low or no calorie sweeteners, meaning things like stevia that's not artificial, and is an option. I think that there's a little bit of hesitation to make some big statements around those kinds of sweeteners, because there's more and more evidence coming out of some issues, like around maybe an increase in diabetes, as well as changes to the gut microbiome because of artificial sweeteners. And so the evidence isn't strong enough yet to say that there's a real problem that would say don't consume these products, but they didn't want to make a big deal like, oh, if you drink soda, just drink diet instead. And so there was a real discussion around what we know about the various types of beverages, and in some ways the answer that came up was that there's not as much evidence as there needs to be to really get at the details of even should people consume water. Obviously, people should consume water for just the necessity of life, but the details of how much water people should consume and all those details, I think it's going to take longer and better studies on some of those issues to really have dietary guidance that makes those very specific points. So at this point, it does say that artificially sweetened drinks are an option to replace, but yes, the reason why it's not in my broad overview is because there isn't a big discussion about it.
Excellent, thank you. We have another question from a different Kristen Monroe-Layton. She says, how can we relate these updates to the Choose My Plate materials when working with patients, and does Choose My Plate match well with those guidelines?
Yes. So the first thing I will say is yes, it absolutely does. The MyPlate, or Choose My Plate, is the name of the website. They call the actual item MyPlate, is basically created by the same people who work on the dietary guidelines. So and at this point, everyone who does MyPlate does not believe it needs to be updated because of these guidelines. So at this point, it will stay the same. And so yes, absolutely. Some of the MyPlate materials, they will be putting out new materials. They're trying to put out new things in Spanish and maybe other languages, and so there will be new things coming out, but the fundamentals of that are not going to change. It very much fits within the dietary patterns that are recommended here.
Excellent, thank you. Speaking of that, if I could take 1 minute to pause, I meant to share this earlier, and I disconnected my email for speed purposes of my internet, so I can't at the moment, but Choose My Plate is having a sale on some materials. They have some new vegetable fruit wheels. I will send out an email. I'll forward an email to everybody who attended later today, but the sale goes on through the end of the month, and I wanted to mention that. Benita, if you actually have that email accessible and want to share it on screen, we can do that, but I will definitely send that out later today to everybody so that they can see that. We do have another question. Speaking of water, Cindy asks, some people use distilled water in their daily water intake. Is there any advantage to using distilled water in the diet?
So that was not even touched by the dietary guidelines. And I do have to say it's not an area that I know the research on. So I am going to say at this point, I don't know. That's definitely something that I do think there are maybe some reasons to just be a little cautious about distilled water, because of course when you distill something, you take everything other than the H2O out of it. And there are some benefits to some of the nutrients that you get in water. It might be very small, but there are little bits of some minerals and things that are in water. And as long as you're getting clean water, I would think distilled water might not be the best idea, but that's not based on, I will say, I don't know of any research that's saying not to do that.
Excellent, thank you. Krista asks, did you say that there were specific guidelines around vegan and vegetarian diet in the new guidelines?
So, sort of. What I will say is the way they come up with the dietary guidelines is through doing dietary pattern analysis and making sure that it meets all the nutrient needs. And they have 3 dietary patterns that are the fundamentals of what they use. One is just called a standard American diet. Then they do another one that's called sort of a Mediterranean dietary pattern that's much more based on seafood and vegetables. And then they do a healthy vegetarian pattern. But they don't do a vegan pattern specifically to come up with what would be a vegan diet that meets all the nutrient needs. They only do a vegetarian one. Having said that, within the guidelines, there are a lot of places where they point out that people who are vegan should do this or that in terms of like making sure that that people who are vegan are taking a B12 supplement kind of thing, because you won't get any B12 from your diet, that kind of thing. Although I will say there are little ways that you can get B12 from your diet if you're vegan. Like if you eat some seaweed, there's some evidence that some seaweed has B12, but it's things like that where they will mention veganism. But there's only a dietary pattern for vegetarians within the guidelines, if that makes sense.
Excellent, thank you. Krista says thank you. Do we have any more questions out there? I know I wanted to ask one. So the new nutrition food labels are rolling out, and I think they've delayed them a couple of times, but aren't they supposed to be finished by sometime in 2022?
Yes, so right now, all the big food companies, I think it's over 2 million. If they have over $2 million in sales, they are already required to have the new label on any of their food. There's an expansion for small companies just because they need a little more time because they don't have the money to change their packaging as fast. So some of them have until 2022, but all of the big companies, all of the big names, the General Mills, the Coke, Pepsi, anything like that, it has the new label at this point.
Excellent. So did the food guidelines work in any way with creating the new food labels? Or did one come before the other? And then as a follow-up question, did they address what you would have wanted them to? I follow food labels. I read all my food labels. So I'm kind of curious about that.
So I was very involved in the process of creating those new labels. Obviously, it's FDA that does that. So they did the basics, but then they have to come to the other agencies like USDA and CDC and NIH. And so we worked with them and went through all of that. The food label was based on the 2015 guidelines. It came out, they came out with the recommendations soon after the 2015 guidelines, and then it took time and they were delayed a number of times. But so it's only becoming complete as the 2020 guidelines has come out. Having said that, I've had a lot of conversations with FDA, and they are not worried. They don't see anything within the current guidelines that would in any way change their guidelines for the label. And they specifically do have guidelines for the labels of foods for infants and toddlers. So in some ways, they already had that information even before the guidelines came out with guidance for infants and toddlers. But there's nothing that they saw that would suggest a need to update the label in that regard. Whereas USDA is right now talking a little bit about whether they might change the school meals program, if there are things in there that would suggest a need to change things. They might be changing something to address the 10% of calories from added sugar that they chose to wait until that was on the label. And so the last change in the school meal program used a standard for total sugar, not for added sugars. So there are some things going on, but this is all done sort of, it's like one thing happens, another thing happens, and they all have to make this decision about when there's enough to decide that something needs to be changed. Excellent.
Very interesting. That started in 2015 and just now getting to our food label. So
yeah, exactly.
That's kind of crazy. Any other questions out there? Benita, you are really breaking up. You may have to put your headset on. She had this issue in an earlier webinar this morning. So we'll give you just a second, let you get, or you can type it in if you want, Benita, and I'll ask it. While Benita is preparing, did anybody else have a question? While she's doing that, I will say I will update our website this week, early next week. I will put all of the resources on it. I will send up a follow-up email so that you guys can go. You can have access to the recording, the PowerPoint, all of these other resources. I will also, the first of next week, send out a meeting evaluation. Please take the time to fill that out. Let us know how we did. Let us know how you like this. And also feel free to suggest future topics. We're going to do these pretty much monthly. So if you have speakers or topics that you would like to see entertained during one of these webinars, let us know and we will start working on it. Benita, are you set to go? You are muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Oh, yes.
Much better.
Sorry about that. I'm not sure why it does it. It did it this morning too. So what I was saying is mine isn't really, it's just a comment. I liked the slide where you had the visuals on the sugar and where we get the sugar from. And I noticed, as you said, the sugar sweetened drinks. But in the beginning, you said something about alcohol, and if people drank alcohol, that increased. But I didn't see alcoholic drinks inside that visual. So I thought, you know, it would be really nice to, when you're educating, that you could actually show a visual that, oh yeah, I really am taking in that much sugar when I'm drinking whatever.
Yeah, that is something that has not been done. In the 2015 guidelines, there was a little more information and some graphics about alcohol that got into some of those details, but I think there was, in some ways, because of all of the addition of the B24 and the pregnancy and lactation, there wasn't exactly the room to go into as much of that detail from on where people are getting calories from alcoholic beverages, and the focus was much more on really the new evidence that's where for so long the dietary guidelines almost made it sound like it would be healthier to drink than to not drink. And so there's been this move, as the evidence has clearly shown, that really isn't true, that it's that certainly there isn't the evidence that someone who drinks moderately is going to be in real trouble, but there's plenty of evidence that if you don't drink, there's no reason to starve for your health. And that's a lot of where they were focusing rather than on the calories. But I think that's something that could come up in the future.
Thank you.
Yes, it seems like I read more and more articles every day that say no drinks. You would be much healthier without any drinks. So I'm curious if the next edition does address that and specifically says, you know, gets away from the one drink for a woman, two drinks for a man.
Well, certainly that was a debate point. The committee actually said that they should change it to moderate drinking is one drink across the board. It is considered a big deal to change a numeric recommendation. That's why it took so long to move away from the 300 milligrams cholesterol, even as the evidence was saying that it's really saturated fat that affects blood cholesterol. And so in the end, the decision was made that the evidence was not strong enough at this point to change that numeric recommendation. But I expect that by 5 years from now, that will definitely change. And it will, because that was really based on this idea of men are bigger in general, so therefore, and the evidence doesn't really suggest that it really is more about the amount of alcohol that you get, and so it doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman. It really is about that most likely, if you are a drinker, drinking one drink in a day should be the maximum.
And I think that we have a blood pressure awareness program here in Kentucky, and one of the teaching points is around alcohol, and then we're looking at a curriculum to complement, and there's really not a lot out there, so that's the reason I ask. If there's a visual that you could complement with the education, then people can see it versus us just saying, you know, you need to, so.
Well, one thing I would say is it's worth looking at the CDC's alcohol program. We do have a whole alcohol program. We'll say they tend to focus on trying to get heavy drinkers to drink less, so they don't necessarily have just materials for the average drinker, but they do have a lot of materials, and so it's just cdc.gov/alcohol, and there is a lot of information there. And I've worked with that group for years to make sure that the dietary guidelines are accurate, and they've got a lot of information that could be available to use.
Thank you.
All right. Kristen has a comment. She says, can we borrow the visuals from your slides for patient education, or are those available online?
So I don't know if they've been posted yet, but yes, they are. The dietary guidelines are public. Everything about them is public. If they aren't up there yet, they are going to be very shortly done as slides. These are from USDA and HHS. But what I will say is, if they aren't up there yet and you have any trouble taking them from my presentation, you can do a cut from the dietary guidelines if you have one of those cut tools and pull the graphics from there. That's how I've done it before. HHS sent me the slide set, but it might have been one of the materials that went up in the email I got just a couple days ago, but I haven't looked to see. But they will be up there soon if they're not, because they do intend to make those all available.
Okay, the presentation I'm posting from you is a PDF, but maybe we'll continue to work to get the actual PowerPoint, and then I can assist anybody if they want help getting some of those graphics off the actual PowerPoint. It's just a large file.
Yeah, I'll check to see if they put them up on the website, and if they didn't, I can send you the slides, because they really are, I mean, they are meant to be public. They're not. The only problem, I was having a problem because of the size, but you know, since it's not me sending my presentation, I could send it to you in several emails with just a couple slides in each one. Just because we've got all these security things that won't let me send them by Dropbox, and it's kind of crazy. So
we
yeah.
have the same thing. We're limited to 10 megabytes on our emails. So if you break that into half or a third, that would be fine. And then I can put it back together and post it, and they can download it if they want to, and then get the graphics. So that will be excellent. We are almost out of time. One little follow-up question on the alcohol thing. How does the alcohol get away with not having the nutrition stuff? Because I think that's one of the major problems was there's a lot of calories in alcohol that people take in, and it's not on the side of the label. So
this has been an issue that has been going on for many years. FDA has been trying to do labeling of alcohol, and there are some big forces that try to stop that. I
gotcha. Say no more. I understand.
There may be. It's still they want more than anything. It'd be nice to have the nutrition facts label, but they just want to have the ingredients listed. And I can say for me, I have celiac disease, and so it really is a problem because it's amazing how pure wine would be fine for me to drink, but it's amazing how many wines actually have a lot of like random stuff put in it or some liquors, and without that listing of what's in there, it's very hard to know if there could be some gluten containing product in there, or and so that's a thing that I have been very aware of, is the fact that they don't label what is actually in the alcohol, and in some cases it's not just the alcohol that you might think or expect. So
excellent.
It's an important issue.
All right, if there are no more questions, again, I would like to thank you so much. I'm clapping. It was a great presentation. Appreciate it very much. I welcome everybody again for coming. Thank you for coming. Our next Task Talks is going to be April 29th. That's also a Thursday at 11 a.m. We're going to have one of our fellow coworkers from Public Health, Sarah Genie, is going to speak to us about the Kentucky Behavioral Risk Factor Survey and all of the things that she can provide us in data and such. So I welcome you all. Look for follow-up emails, and thanks for joining us.